welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to take a dispassionate look at the ongoing RCEP negotiations. With the deadline for concluding the negotiations less than 2 months away, the question we're posing today is what is the cost-benefit trade-off for India if we join this mega trade pact between the 10 ASEAN members and their 6 FTA partners? Australia, New Zealand, China, India, Japan and South Korea that together account for about 25% of global GDP, 30% of trade, 26% of FDI and 45% of the world's population. Granted, trade negotiations always entail some give and some take. But as we've seen with the FTAs or the free trade agreements that we've signed to date, there's a strong sense that India has given much more than it has taken. Is that a correct perception? What can we do to ensure a fairer deal? We're going to ask this excellent panel of trade experts that we have here with us. Rajiv Kher, former Commerce Secretary, Government of India, who's been closely involved with the negotiations. Abhijit Das, Head, WTO Center, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi. And T.S. Vishwanath, Principal Advisor, APJ SLG Law Advisors, New Delhi, who's been keeping a keen eye on trade for decades. Welcome to the show, Mr. Kher, Abhijit and Vishi. Let me start by posing the same questions that right in the beginning that I asked. Have we done our homework sufficiently well? That is always a niggling doubt that we have when we sign these FTAs, particularly in the context of RCEP. Mr. K, let me start with you. Have we done our homework sufficiently well?
See, RCEP, and before I answer your question, we need to look at a slightly broader picture because it's not simply quantitative in terms of quantitative outcomes that we need to look at this issue. We also need to look at it in how the global situation has evolved over the last some years. Now, you look at the fact that multilateral systems have collapsed for the time being at least. The global economy has slowed down. Trade conflict between US and China is going on. Global manufacturing base has moved into Asia for some time now. And RCEP is a group of these 16 countries which is where the manufacturing base has pivoted to. Now, if you have an agreement of that proportion and you keep India out, the biggest worry is that you exclude yourself from any future economic development that happens in the region. But that is just one. The more important thing which I perceive is that India needs a trigger to do some policy reforms. Unfortunately, we have not been able to do those policy reforms. And this is not today, this is not yesterday, it has been for quite some time. Therefore, RCEP is an opportunity. It is our record that whenever there has been a threat, we have done something well. And I don't see a reason why we should not believe that industry will be resilient, governance will improve, and therefore will give us an opportunity of being able to participate in RCEP. Okay. So at the moment, I'll leave it at that without giving you a quantitative assessment.
Obviously, do you agree with that assessment? Have we done our homework sufficiently well? Why is there this perception always that we tend to never look before we leap, or at least we don't look sufficiently carefully? Is that perception true in the context of RCEP also?
Mythili, I really do not know whether we've done our homework well since I'm not involved with the negotiations, but I can delineate what should have been the components of our homework, and I hope our negotiators have done the homework well. On the export front, let's be clear that RCEP as well as any of these mega FTAs are not only about tariffs. They are about non-tariff barriers, they are about subsidies given by other countries, they are about non-transparency in domestic procedures, for example, in giving clearances to exporters. So I do hope we have seeded these concepts at the early stages of negotiations.
Okay.
On the defensive side, one concern really has been imports from China. So I do hope we have some mechanisms in place to make sure that the industry gets some protection from surging imports from China. Okay. These are some of the key elements of the homework which I do hope our negotiators have done. And I have reason to believe that they would have done. But just one word about the past FTAs, let's bear in mind that India's tariffs are relatively higher compared to its trading partners. So naturally, we end up giving much higher tariff concessions, much higher market access. compared to our trading partner.
Of course, we're also much poorer. That should also perhaps be factored in.
Absolutely. And because of which there will be import surges that cannot be wished away from an FTA, unless we do an FTA with countries at similar level of tariffs as us.
Vishy, as a former journalist, you belong to the tribe of skeptics. So how do you see RCEP?
Well, let me give you, Mythili, from a point of view of industry, and having worked with industry reasonably close enough, they are reasonably skeptical about the RCEP. They do think that the RCEP is not something which is going to yield much in terms of access for them, but it may end up taking away some of their market. But having said that, it is not that they are completely against the whole concept. They do understand the larger play in terms of saying that India needs to be part of the region, and and this is something which can actually help them. But there are three things which I think they are very wary about. One, they're not worried about the ASEAN or Japan or Korea, because we already have an FTA with all of them. So they're saying that is something which is taken care of. Their main concern comes from China, while Australia and New Zealand are also countries with whom we don't have an FTA, but they don't seem very concerned. Maybe the agricultural side is, but the industrial, the sectors of the industrial side are not very concerned about Australia and New Zealand. But China is an area which they are reasonably concerned about, and they have been constantly in talks with the government to ensure that we don't have a surge happening from China, and that they would get enough time and enough policy support from the government to ensure that even if a surge does happen, they are competitive enough to kind of handle that surge.
I think we've always been very wary of our big neighbor to the east, not just in the matter of trade, but on a whole host of other issues as well. But Mr. Kher, if you look at FTAs, FTAs very often tend to be trade diverting rather than trade enhancing. And that's really been our position also in the case of all the FTAs that we've signed so far. I was looking at some data, and if you look at trade with the countries with whom we signed FTAs, there's been a very marginal increase in the total trade with them. So if it's only going to be trade diverting and not enhancing, which is what we need, then why do we go in for an RCEP, which is ultimately a much larger FTA in some ways?
See, this approach to taking FTAs as merely trade diversionary, I think this needs a little correction. I appreciate the point. I appreciate the point in a technical sense. But it's always in the beginning that they are trade diversionary. As you create scales, as you integrate better, as you board value chains, as you go on negotiating and removing layers of non-tariff barriers, as you integrate, the two economies of FTA partners give dividends to each other. How much dividend have you been able to use for yourself is not the determination of FTA alone. It is how you have positioned yourself to utilize that FTA. Now, I accept the criticism on FTAs with Korea, Japan particularly, not ASEAN so much. The reason has been that when we looked east in a purely foreign policy orientation, we created an FTA with ASEAN. And then we went on and did Korea and Japan. Well, by signing those three FTAs, it did not mean that we will start benefiting from them. We needed to do a whole lot of domestic reforms to become competitive, because these were all trading economies, these were our large economies, very well integrated in global marketplace. So unless we should have done that, expecting that there would be returns out of our FTAs would be, I think, stretching the argument too far.
But then, Abhijit, if that is the case, should we not have set our domestic house in order and then got into FTAs? Agreed, as Mr. Kher says, we have not been able to utilize the supposed benefits. But if we're not in a position, then should we not have waited, done our domestic reforms, and then opened up our country big time?
I couldn't agree with you more, Mythili. I am not a votary of the approach that we need a foreign trigger to stimulate domestic reforms. That would be an admission of total failure of our system. Reform has to be triggered domestically so that you can determine the pace of reform, you can determine the sectors of reform. If we are going to be guided by reform through our external engagement, then we might end up in a bad situation. Let me give you a prime example. In late 1990s, India entered into something called the Information Technology Agreement. We lowered our tariffs to zero on IT hardware. Industry in that sector was struggling. But because of the zero tariffs, it got decimated.
True.
So I am not very sure that the Indian industry has the resilience to face import competition. If ITA is an example, it may be a stray example, it may be a lone example. Industry did not show resilience.
Okay.
So we really need to be careful that whatever commitments we enter into through the RCEP, we are able to make sure that the sad experience of ITA is not repeated.
Which is the general opinion is that industry is, vociferously against the entire RCEP. But the fact is, and Piyush Goyal said that we will not allow national interest, a few industries to come in the way of national interest. But the fact is, the industry is not one homogeneous entity. Some industries will benefit and some will lose out. So is it possible for us to identify which are the sunrise industries, which are the sunset industries? And if these sunrise industries are going to benefit, then maybe, which is a trade-off, which are the benefit more than the loss? Can we have a more nuanced approach and, ensure that whatever safeguards we have, they will benefit the sunrise industries? Is it possible to work within the framework of RCEP, since government seems now determined for whatever reason to go ahead with it?
Mythili, you're absolutely right. And in fact, if I might take the same example of what Abhijit was talking about, the ITA, things have actually changed. Just last week, I was with that whole industry. We have done a whole work with them in terms of trying to see how do they become export competitive.
Okay.
So the industry is trying to come back and start saying we need to get competitive again. So I would tend to agree a bit with also with Mr. Kher, what he said, the fact that I think what helped was that the opening up did bring about some kind of reforms, and I think it got industry thinking that they do not now have a choice but have to get competitive. If you keep looking at only doing it from a very domestic perspective, I think industry would never ever agree to any reforms. If I may wear a bit of a journalistic hat here, I think since having covered industry from the early 90s, I'm yet to come across any sector which is willing for reforms. They are always wanting to protect themselves. They're always wanting to stop imports from coming in. I think what we need to look at is how do we make industry competitive, and for that, if we need to open up, we're willing to open up. A second big issue which you talked about right now, you talked about sunrise sectors. I think it's not just about sunrise sectors. If you look at it, there's a disruption happening in industry all across the world. There are completely new sectors and new things which are coming up across the world. And I think when we're looking at an RCEP and we're looking 15 years from now, that's the kind of tariff, and 20 years and 15 years is when we are saying the tariffs would go away. I think we need to look at sectors which would then exist when disruption would have happened. And is that something which we can seriously look at? In my view, neither has industry nor has government seriously looked at it from that perspective. I think we are negotiating based on the current level of where our industry is and where the level of technology is.
It's always a question of balancing short-term interests and long-term interests. Can you maximize, the long-term, yes, there might be a gain, but in the short term, can you minimize the pain? That really is the issue, particularly at the time when you're passing through a very difficult juncture in the Indian economy. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with 3 trade experts on the ongoing RCEP negotiations. Can we do the negotiation in such a way that we maximize the benefits and minimize whatever cost there is, because there will inevitably be some cost and some pain? Mr. Kher, for all the public posturing about RCEP, etc., the fact is we have a huge worry about India-China. That really is the issue. Like in the case of SAARC, where India, Pakistan dominates everything else. So can we think in terms of some kind of a twin track approach, where we have one kind of track with China and another track with the rest of the RCEP members? Is it possible at all?
As a matter of fact, as far as the tariff negotiations go, that's what has happened. With China, the concessions are at a lesser level of opening up.
And are the other members okay with that?
Yeah, that's what is happening. Okay. I think there is plus minus 6. But that is a fact which I think everybody has factored in. Okay. Given the choice, I would have preferred a much lower level of opening for China.
Okay.
So that is accepted. I think more important we need to look at, and I have heard Abhijit and Vishwanath on this. See, you need to understand that if you prepare yourself in terms of domestic policy reforms and the manner in which it happens, whether you call it an acceptance of failure or whatever you call it,
right.
The point is that is the world going to wait for you? And if you visualize a situation where you have the global economy being what it is, and these 16 nations forming a group, and India, which is a large market and which has its potential, which has capacity to be able to participate in this marketplace, and which has ambitions, I don't think you keep yourself out of it, and yet you will be able to carry your reforms over a foreseeable future for simple reasons. One, our trade orientation has often been, in fits and jerks. We opened up in 91.
Sure.
We exploited the external markets because of those wage arbitrages that we used at that point in time. And then by the time we were in 2010, when the world's economy had slowed down, we realized that we had nowhere else to go, because our inherent competitiveness was unavailable to us. Now, world is changing very fast. China is vacating lower levels of product manufacturing, low technology, low wages. There are competitors. There are countries which are vying for that marketplace. India is positioned for that. India should, if it changes a few of its policies, if it brings in a new environment in industry, which I entirely agree with Vishy, that, see, there is this industry's resistance to opening up, whether you have the best of the economic environment domestically,
but do we have?
Still
that
remain.
Is the problem. No, yes, we like to condemn industry, saying they always want protection. But the fact is, they also work under enormous odds in our country. Abhijit, in fact, Mr. Kher mentioned a very interesting point. He said about the large market that we have. In fact, I think that all the trade partners are salivating at the thought of a large market that India offers. But are we, in turn, reciprocally going to get that large market? The fears about China, for instance, can we have strict rules of origin to ensure that whatever we do to China, the goods don't come in through some other countries, and then it leads to, there's no value addition in India, because the entire talk of make in India is because we want value addition in India. So can we do something like ensure strict rules of origin? How effective are they?
Mythili, rules of origin can work in two ways.
Okay.
One is they can prevent, let's say, products from entering into India which were not entitled for the concessions.
Right.
The second way is have loose rules of origin to facilitate something like a deeper integration into value chains. So we have to strike a balance.
Okay.
Now, we've talked of the twin track vis-a-vis China. My apprehension is that even if we have a twin track approach, given the fact that there are some requirements technically called cumulation, whose advantage China will take, and even if we have a twin track approach, and even if in a particular product the opening up for China is backloaded, China can very well send the same products, legally speaking, through some other RCEP country.
Right.
So this entire idea of trying to block China by delaying transition, delaying the tariff concessions, that one has to be extremely cautious about.
Vishy, both Mr. Kher and Abhijit spoke about manufactured items in China, because China is a big threat in the case of manufactured items. But New Zealand and Australia are also a big threat in the case of dairy industries. And that's where these non-tariff barriers that Abhijit spoke about come into in a big way, because Indian agricultural products, dairy products, we're just not able to compete against a very legitimate quote-unquote non-tariff barriers. So are we really kind of batting for, on the wrong side, as it were?
I think this whole issue of being protective on agriculture, I think, is a little overplayed.
You don't think the NTB
I don't think we
sanitary?
need to worry about Australia and New Zealand sending us dairy products, which are so cheap that they can actually beat our quality of, or they can compete with the price at which our dairy products are sold. What they may come up here with, and this is something which is based on my discussions with some of the New Zealanders and Australians who are based in the agriculture industry, they would like to send some value-added products here, because what they are looking at is the high end of the market. Okay. While we might keep saying that we are a billion-plus market, that's not what the whole world is looking at. They're looking at a very small niche market, which is large enough for them, but at the same time they can bring in some niche products. So I would not think that Australia and New Zealand, frankly, pose a threat to them. Politically, yes, but economically, I don't think it's much of an issue in terms of looking at an agricultural product. But on manufacturing, I think just to come on this point of China, I would still say that I don't think we can really stop products from coming in from China, even if you have an MFN duty. I don't think our main customs duties are at a level by which we can stop products from coming into China. What we really need is a strategy to deal with China, and for industry to understand how can they deal with China so that they can work with China and build competitiveness to face the Chinese onslaught.
Unfortunately, it's not just Indian industry. I think the whole world doesn't know how to deal with China, so we are all in the same predicament. Mr. Kerry, you spoke about how important it is to be part of the club. And in fact, I think RCEP members have sent sufficient signals that, okay, if not RCEP 16, we can RCEP of 15 is okay, good, well enough. In fact, Mahathir Mohamad has made it quite clear that, if India doesn't want to join, we are quite happy to drop India. And there's also talk about the ASEAN plus 3. So you did talk about the fact that it's important to be part of the club because there you have some influence on the rules, etc. But isn't India already sufficiently excluded? Where are we in the global supply chains? So how much worse can it get? If you're going to pay a much heavier price for being in the club, why not stay out? I'm taking a very extreme position, but I just want to know your views.
First of all, exactly for the reasons which you mentioned, I think India should be part of the club.
Okay.
You have not been able to be on the value chains. You have not been able to be there because the manner in which we structure our policy and structure our thoughts, structure our industrial production has never accounted into their considerations the benefits of a value chain based production. So one of the advantages is that we need to now board these value chains.
Okay.
It is not as if world is living in a static environment. Things are changing.
Sure.
And why do we expect that China will continue to manufacture at the lowest levels of technology and wages?
Sure. Except that those industries are moving to Vietnam, to Bangladesh,
But
Cambodia. They're not coming to India.
They are moving there because we are not able to provide them an alternative. And that alternative cannot just be corporate tax reduction.
Sure.
That is one. But
The
there are a
entire
whole lot of
ecosystem, yes.
ecosystem-related issues. There are trade-related issues. There are sectoral reforms.
Sure, sure.
So unless we address this whole, any FTA cannot be taken as an isolated policy instrument. FTA is a strategic instrument which has to be housed in a larger economic policy reform. Okay. So you use FTA as a strategic tool rather than negotiate an FTA and then leave it for implementation to to nobody.
Oh, okay.
So what I have been talking about is that we need to have a completely different approach to FTAs. Now the problem is that if you can't be waiting for you to develop that approach to FTAs, because actually we should have had this approach 5 years ago.
Okay.
So therefore now this is our opportunity for developing that approach.
Okay.
We have a threat at our door. If we allow it to pass by and don't take advantage of the opportunities which are lurking out of it,
We'll be the
it will be
losers.
too late.
Okay. Abhijit, India's strength really is in services, where definitely we are competitive even on a global scale. But RCEP, the focus seems to be entirely other countries are interested in our market and they're looking at goods. Have we been able to push home our advantage in services in these negotiations?
Before I come to services, Mythili, I thought I would just mention one fact about what Vishwanath talked about earlier. If you look at the farm gate prices of Fonterra in New Zealand, fresh milk, skim milk powder, whole milk powder, butter oil, their farm gate prices are much lower than the prices prevailing in India. So we need to be cognizant of the possibility that things may not be entirely hunky-dory if we have a surge in imports of dairy products from New Zealand and Australia.
And that is a possibility, you feel?
One can't rule out if we end up opening the dairy market at a very large scale. Coming back to services, yes, services is our strength, but how do we capitalize on the strength? One is through getting commitments in the services schedule, but a more important aspect is, can we in some manner discipline the ability of those countries to prevent our services exports through domestic regulations? Can we get into a mutual recognition agreement of our qualifications? Those are the areas where we must focus.
I think we haven't had much progress in that aspect at all.
In Indo-Singapore, we had a commitment that after the agreement starts getting implemented, we will get into an MRA. That was something like a post-dated check. And it took almost a decade to sign MRAs in a couple of sectors. I hope we have learned the lesson while we are doing RCEP, and I'll be delighted if at the end we see a few MRAs between India and China, Australia, and some other, Japan, Korea as well in some of the services sectors. If that happens, then yes, we will be able to exploit the opportunity. If it doesn't, then it's
our strength is really our people, and I think we need to capitalize on that. But Vishy, I think the Piyush Goyal has started working on things like strengthening anti-dumping, countervailing duties, etc. Will these measures suffice? What other changes do we need to make to ensure that RCEP is not just lose-lose as the industry is fearing, but some win, some lose, and more win than lose if possible?
I mean, anti-dumping is something which has been there for long, and I don't think that is something which can help us from an FTA for the simple reason that anti-dumping only happens when there is unfair trade. What industry would seriously look for is even when there is fair trade happening there, would there be triggers and safeguards that can protect them from surges that will happen and which could happen from China. And from what industry understands from the negotiators is that there would be some mechanism which would help them in terms of, especially for those products which would be sensitive. Now, would that really happen? Would that not only when the negotiations end and when things happen, it would happen? But industry is of the view that the minister is reasonably aware of the sensitivities, and the negotiators are fully aware of the sensitivities, and there would be something which would help them negotiate because they are now very clear that they can't get out of RCEP. RCEP is there for everybody, and they would only hope for some safeguards that would happen.
So since we're running out of time, a last quick question to both of you, Mr. Kher as well as Abhijit. What are the changes, 1, 2, 3, very quickly, that we need to see before we get into RCEP? Mr. Kher.
Before we get into the RCEP,
I mean, like, sign on. We're almost there.
We are almost there.
Yeah.
But I think the most important is that we need to desecularize our approach. We need to identify champions, which is not difficult. We have already done that. The sectors. And we need to carry out sectoral policy reforms in all of those sectors.
That's a very difficult wish list. Abhijit, would you like to add to that? What do we need to have in place?
To give a fillip to manufacturing, I do think there's a strong case for labor reforms, number one. And second, logistics cost. That is something which we really need to address. If we are able to do both these reforms, then we'll be better positioned to take advantage of RCEP.
Okay. I do hope the government and the Commerce Ministry particularly, and the Minister is listening very carefully to this, because before we rush headlong into something, I think it's very important that we do our homework and see what is to our advantage. And that sometimes one wonders whether the government is sufficiently aware of all these issues. But thank you so much, Mr. Kher, Abhijit and Vishy, for joining me in this really fascinating discussion. And I do hope Mr. Goyal is listening with both his ears and takes care of all the concerns that I think we are expressing on behalf of all our countrymen. Thank you also for watching. And remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.